Everyone, and welcome back to World History. This week we're going to talk about Chapter 27, the making of modern Latin America. Now, something I wanted to cover real quick before we hop into lecture is that there were a couple of assignments this week that had issues with submissions. There was a setting that got flipped and I didn't realize it. However, those assignments should now be accepting uploads. So if you have any assignments missing from this past week, please go ahead and submit those. Or if you had assignments, I should rephrase, if you had assignments that you had difficulty submitting to me, please go ahead and check those assignments and resubmit them if you can. If you have any issues, please don't hesitate to contact me. Contact me and we'll get it sorted. But let's go ahead and dive into the lesson. So let's talk about the many countries of Latin America. Now, whenever we talk about Latin America, we have to talk about the many ancient native tribes of Central and South America. These gave way to conquerors from Spain and other European countries in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, the American Revolution inspired many people to our south to rise up against British and European rulers, just as the British colonies in America had done. By 1825, most Latin American colonies had gained their freedom and had become countries. Now, the Spanish colonial system itself had a rigid social structure. At the top were what were known as the wealthy peninsulares. These are people from the Iberian Peninsula, the modern location of Spain and Portugal. Only peninsulares could hold the highest of political and church offices, and many received huge land grants from the king. Below them were the Creoles, ethnic Spanish born in America. They couldn't hold the highest offices, but they could gain wealth and power through business endeavors. The third class was the Mestizos, people of mixed European and South and Central American Indian descent. These people had many different kinds of positions in the colonies, from laborers to lawyers. Then, at the very bottom of the social ladder were the African slaves and the few indigenous people remaining in these countries. The peninsulares had the most to lose to potential shakeups to the social structure, being the wealthiest at the top. However, many Creoles were frustrated with the fact that they could never rise higher in this power structure. And small, relatively weak uprisings began occurring in Peru and Colombia, but these were quickly crushed by the Spanish around the 1780s. There were also attempts to take over Venezuela in the 1800s, but neither of these attempts lasted long. Now, the first successful revolution was in Haiti, on the island of Hispaniola. About 500,000 slaves worked on sugar plantations there for the French. After the 1789 revolutions in France, a man named Toussaint L'Ouverture led a 13-year revolt against their masters. Now, this fighting took many lives and ended the French control of Haiti. The rebels also seized the eastern half of the island, which became the Dominican Republic. Napoleon had sent his brother, Charles Leclerc, to Haiti to end the rebellion, and after much bitter fighting, Leclerc tricked Toussaint into being taken prisoner. On January 1st, of course, two other leaders took up the cause. On January 1st, 1804, the independent Republic of Haiti was reestablished. Most of the revolutionaries in Haiti were slaves. This frightened many Latin American landowners who were afraid of an uprising. And this successful revolution encouraged those who wanted to see European rule end in the Western Hemisphere, feared to hold their own revolutions. Simón Bolívar was the lead figure in the Latin American fight for freedom, and we'll talk about him in a little bit. He and José de San Martin worked together to lead Argentina to independence in 1816. San Martin and another Chilean general marched across the Andes into Chile, which became independent after fighting in 1818. San Martin and other freedom fighters' goal was for one nation made up of former Spanish colonies. However, this would not be realized, even if the independence of these colonies were. There were a few issues that caused this. Local groups that had banded together to oust the Spanish now began fighting against one another. Power struggles amongst leaders of these groups led to civil wars. In addition, the huge area and diverse geography would have been almost impossible to govern from one capital. Now, local leaders and local interests took precedent over any grand hypothetical scheme. These large colonies that gained independence eventually divided into 18 South American countries. Even the Dominican Republic itself declared its independence from Haiti. Now, the difficulties for these new Latin American countries were many. They created a constitutional representative government, but had no real experience in running these types of governments. When problems arose, the military often took control by placing dictators in place to run a country. The new nations had a new social structure, now headed by the Creoles, who did not want to share their powers with the Mestizos. Slaves were freed, slavery was abolished, but these Africans and Indians had few rights and continued to live in poverty. By the way, whenever your book mentions Indians at this point in time, we're not talking about the American Indian tribes. We're talking about the native indigenous tribes to these areas. The national economy at this point in time was also struggling to get up off the ground. Wealth was still largely held by only a few people, often in the previously higher realm of the Peninsulares, but now some Creoles too. Latin American economies were tied to trade with European nations. Many countries were dependent on one or two products, like sugar or copper, and when these world markets cooled for these items, the local economy lagged. As these revolutions were happening before everything settled down around 1820s, Spain requested help from its allies in Europe to retake Latin American colonies. Now, Britain and the United States opposed such a move. Britain was hoping to develop trade relations with the new nations, and the U.S. also wanted to develop trade, but tried to stand for the principle of freedom as well. Britain wanted to make a combined statement of opposition with America, but America beat them to the punch, creating what's known as the Monroe Doctrine. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams wrote a section of President James Monroe's annual speech to Congress in 1823, which declared that European nations should no longer view the Western Hemisphere as a target for colonization. This Monroe Doctrine was given teeth by the British Navy, and Europe kept its political hands out of the Western Hemisphere. It should be noted they kept it out of their hands out of this military-wise. They did not keep their hands out of it economic-wise. These economic arrangements led to European involvement in other ways. The ruler of a Latin American country may arrange a loan from a European bank, pocket most of the money himself, and then default on the loan. This would cause the European nations involved to pressure the Latin American country to clean up its act or face serious consequences. So, a lot of the time involvement was often economical or diplomatic, not military-based. Through its contact with Latin America, the U.S. developed a world empire. In 1898, Cuba was still a colony of Spain, but rebels on the island were waging a war for independence. American newspapers supported the revolution at this point in time, and the United States sent a battleship Maine to Havana to protect American interests there. However, the Maine was destroyed mysteriously, and many Americans demanded war with Spain. Spain declared war on America in April of 1898, but the U.S. won quick and decisive victories in what became known as the Spanish-American War. This war ended in December and saw the U.S. gain the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam as parts of the United States. You'll note that the majority of these are still districts within the United States. Because the U.S. had involvement with many of these governments, an amendment was made to the Monroe Doctrine called the Roosevelt Corollary. This corollary gave the U.S. exclusive right to exercise power in the Western Hemisphere. This was primarily done after Cuba developed its own constitutional government around 1900, and the United States insisting that a provision be given to the United States to give them permission to intervene in domestic Cuban affairs. This came to light to be really helpful when two Latin American countries defaulted on loans by European banks and warships from those nations threatened the Latin American countries. Effectively, America has, because of this Roosevelt corollary, exclusive right to exercise international police power within that Western Hemisphere. This policy was implemented several times by later American presidents. As American foreign interests grew, the U.S. realized the importance of a canal through the Isthmus of Panama, then a part of Colombia, so that the U.S. fleet could quickly move to the Atlantic or Pacific as needed. The U.S. bought the rights to the canal from France, who had gone bankrupt before they could finish the canal, and encouraged the successful Revolution of Panama in 1903 to complete the canal by 1914. A canal that is still in use today. The 20th century, I'm going to move myself up here so that you guys can actually see the entirety of the slides, because I just realized that was an issue. Now, the 20th century saw a forward economic process and backwards political turmoil in Latin America. Economic uncertainty and a frequent lack of effective political leadership led to a continued role in the military taking over leadership from the government in coups d'état, French for blow of the state. Often in such cases, military strongmen would impose strict limits on political freedom. A threat to peace at this time occurred with Fidel Castro's takeover of Cuba in 1959. Many Cubans, in light of the now dictator ruling Cuba, fled to Florida, the closest landmass at this point in time, or to other Latin American countries who were not under the same threat. Now, an attempt to oust Castro was made in 1961, and this is referred to as the Bay of Pigs incident, given that the attempt did not go well in the slightest. In April of 1961, about 2,000 Cubans who had been living within the U.S. made a landing by boat in the Bay of Pigs to secretly infiltrate Cuba and dethrone Fidel Castro. Their plan was quickly found out, and we were able to quickly, effectively get these people out. The United States did not provide military air cover for the invasion. These invaders, unfortunately, we got a few of them out, but unfortunately they were quickly defeated by Castro's forces. The invasion didn't generate a Cuban uprising against Castro as the planners had hoped, and this incident was an absolute disaster for foreign policy in the United States. This led to what's known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. In response to the Bay of Pigs, the Soviet Union in 1962 began secretly instilling long-range missiles in Cuba that could strike down the United States. Soviets absolutely denied that this buildup were taking place until U.S. spy planes flew over Cuba and took pictures of the missile sites being constructed. President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade around Cuba to keep further materials from arriving, and after several weeks of heightening tensions, the Soviets backed down and removed the missile sites. In return, the U.S. backed down from further invasions of Cuba to topple Fidel Castro. Political unrest has fared from time to time since the Franklin Roosevelt administration, the U.S. has tried its best to follow a good neighbor policy towards Latin American countries. This has been offering financial aid and other assistance instead of being policeman and a dictator of terms. During the Jimmy Carter presidency, the United States actually signed a treaty giving control of the Panama Canal to the country of Panama itself. And the Organization of American States, a hemispheric council of nations, has tried to promote economic process and open communication amongst member nations. Let's go ahead and let's talk about Mexico specifically. Throughout the 1700s, Mexico was generally a prosperous place for the ruling class, but the same pattern of social classes carried to Mexico and created problems in decline by the 1800s. By 1810, poor priest, Miguel Hidalgo, organized a force of Indians to create a new nation. This group marched towards Mexico City, captured a few provinces, and claimed a republic there. He abolished slavery and redistributed land to the Indians. However, Hidalgo was captured by troops loyal to Spain and executed the following year. This was followed by a man named Jose Morelos, who then took up the banner of revolution and led a revolt further south. Morelos had some success at first, but he too was captured and met the same fate in 1815. A successful revolution, however, did happen. Under the leadership of a man named Agustin de Iturbide, Mexico was declared independent in 1823. However, one of the leaders of there was a coup actually that ousted Iturbide, and this one of those people was a general named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who took over Mexico in a coup and ruled off and on over the next 30 years as he slid in and out of power. Society and the economy were in disarray. The new country had started out deep in debt from expenses incurred under Spain and Iturbide, and conservative liberals vied for power. It was during this time that settlers from the United States began moving into the Mexican province of Texas to settle a huge land grant that Mexico had given to the Austin family. The Texans declared their independence from Mexico on March 2nd, 1836, with the goal of becoming another state in the American Union. Santa Anna fought this move immensely, not wanting to lose that part of Mexico. But the Texans stood firm, and the United States recognized the Republic of Texas in 1836. The annexing of Texas in 1845 and a conflict between Americans and Mexicans led to what is known as the Mexican War. A U.S. victory in this war led to almost all of northern Mexican territory going to the United States. It was a conflict that was over almost before it began. Again, because the army was so disorganized at this point in time. Mexico was almost flattened with debt, destruction, and widespread banditry at this point in time. Mexico sold another piece of property, which was known as the Gadsden Purchase, to the U.S. in 1853 for $10 million to help stimulate its economy. Now, a group of liberals led by Benito Juarez came to power in 1855, forcing the Catholic Church to give up some of its vast land holdings for people to purchase. However, many of the poor were too poor to buy land, and a new constitution went into effect in 1857. Civil War broke out a year later in 1858 between liberals and conservatives, while the French emperor tried to instill the government into Mexico in 1862. Napoleon III attempted to establish Austrian Prince Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico. Maximilian's government floundered, and the French went home. Maximilian was executed in 1867, with Juarez dying in 1872. A man named Porfirio Diaz came to power and ruled either as president or from behind the scenes until 1910. Under his rule, order was returned to the provinces, the army was professionalized, and foreign investors helped to bring about marked economic growth. However, the only major economic change was that the rich tended to get richer at this point in time. The poor generally still did not share in the economic bounty. Now, by 1910, Diaz announced a free election. With opposition mounting, Diaz rigged that election so that he could win. As a result, a revolt erupted and Diaz fled the country. A new government under Francisco Madero, moderate, managed to anger both radicals and conservatives. With conservative support, General Victoriano Huerta overthrew Madero, who was put to death. During Huerta's rule, Pancho Villa led a ragtag group of small bandits in the north. A man named Emiliano Zapata led a small army of farmers in the south, and other groups took up arms against Huerta. Powerless Huerta fled. English. In August of 1914, a man named Venustiano Carreza, a rich landowner, seized power. The United States recognized the Carranza government in 1915, but it was only until about 1917 that the riots ended. 1921 saw the governments that followed try to rule by force, if necessary, while developing the economy. Land reforms and higher wages helped the poorer classes. Mining and industry increased, although the worldwide Great Depression brought economic growth to a halt for a period of time. By the 1930s, the Mexican government had established a state-run collective farms and nationalized foreign oil companies. Opposition parties at this point in time were eliminated by the 1920s. However, others slowly emerged as time went on. And in modern day, Mexico has continued to experience periods of growth and recession. Crime and natural disasters have caused some Mexicans to try to legally immigrate to the United States to better their conditions for them and their families. Let's go ahead and talk about Simon Bolivar. Simón Bolivar was born in Venezuela in 1783. He went to Europe to complete his education and saw the ending of the French Revolution. This and his studies of American government led him to resolving to liberate all of his fellow South Americans from control of Spain. He initially fought many battles and lost several in his initial attempts to liberate these colonies. Bolivar was forced to leave Venezuela, but returned in 1812. Next year, he had an army that captured the city of Caracas, but again, the Spanish regained control of the city, and he was in exile for a period of time in Haiti, where he enlisted Haitian freedom fighters and weapons. He was actually told by the president of Haiti, he was given his blessing with one request, that he outlaw slavery wherever he was successful in fighting for liberty. Bolivar returned to Venezuela in 1817, and by 1819, he had captured the city of Angostura, now called Bolivar City. Colombia was freed under his efforts in 1819, and Ecuador was similarly freed in 1822. By 1822, José de San Martin had met with Bolivar, and they worked together to liberate Peru. San Martin turned leadership over to Bolivar, who was then named dictator and commander of the military. By 1827, Bolivar returned to Colombia to resume presidency. Venezuela and Ecuador broke away from the Grand Republic that he planned, and by 1830, Bolivar resigned from his position. He died later that year at the age of 47. Now, Bolivar's reputation as the liberator of the Latin American countries is justified for his role in doing more than any other single person to break Spain's hold over South America. Bolivar came to oppose slavery and freed his own slaves in 1821. Bolivar did not promote instant democracy. He thought that the best educated and most qualified people should run the government until the general populace was able to take part in it. He was primarily concerned with people like himself, the Creoles, being able to assume positions of leadership in the government. He believed that too much power in the hands of local leaders weakened the progress and security that the central government could provide. Bolivar, by the end of his life, was discouraged by the political instability he saw in his country, and he was an unpopular political figure in his last days. Bolivar, this was primarily due to his own differences with other leaders, as well as his own failings, coupled with the tendency of people to forget what had been done for them in the past. Today, however, many South Americans hold Bolivar in high regard as a hero of their independence. For the last bit, let's talk about the indigenous peoples of Latin America. Today, Latin America is home to at least 400 different indigenous people groups. Many of these groups maintain their traditions but integrate parts of European culture into their own culture, especially the Spanish culture. These groups can be divided into two groups, the Highlanders and the Lowlanders. Highlanders live in densely populated villages in the highlands of Mexico and Central America, and in the Andes of South America. Lowlanders live near the Amazon River and in the lowlands of Central America. Many other indigenous peoples live in cities in Central and South America, while some have immigrated to North America and Europe. Bolivia is the only Latin American country where indigenous people make up a majority of the population. Peru, Guatemala, and Ecuador also have a large indigenous population. However, because of the stigma of being Indian, some may hide their true cultural heritage when census data is collected. About 400 indigenous languages are still spoken in Latin America today. In some countries, more than 200 are spoken. The main indigenous language is known as Quichua, the official language of the Incas. Scholars believe that this language actually predates the Inca Empire by about 1,000 years, but about 8 million people speak Quichua today, but it's spoken in different dialects. Quichua speakers live in rural areas, in the cities in the Andes Mountains, in Amazon rainforests, and on ranches. Millions live in Lima, the capital of Peru, and Quito, the capital of Ecuador. Quichua communities are even found in Amsterdam, Madrid, and in Washington, D.C. Another language named Aymara is spoken in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru, with about 1.5 million residents speaking said language. Another language that's spoken, which a large majority of the residents of Paraguay speak it, is a language called Guarani, where it is an official language alongside Spanish. Now, whenever it comes to village life, indigenous groups have a long history of self-rule. Many indigenous people continue their traditional farming lifestyles. In some villages, the land is owned communally. Highlanders grow crops using well-designed irrigation systems. Some people freeze-dry food in the cold mountain air. Amazonian farmers cut and burn patches of the rainforest, creating temporary fields. They later leave these fields unused so that the forest can regenerate. Some indigenous people raise llamas and alpacas that are native to South America. These have served as beasts of burdens in the Andes Mountains for many centuries and can be used for both the wool for textiles, the leather and tallow for candles and clothing. Fuel and rope can be created all from these animals. Whenever it comes, also some native people will do work in tourism. Along with selling of traditional crafts, this provides an income to these tribes. Clothing at this point has become a mixture of European and traditional garments. Women in some countries will wear a loose blouse and a wrapped skirt around her waist. Over these, she would wear a cloak called a poncho. Blue, brown, and black are traditional colors for Highlanders, and weaving continues to be an art practiced there. Your book goes into a lot more detail about these clothes, and it's kind of interesting to read about the changes that has occurred from what would be traditional garb. But this is very similar to religion, which has become a combination of traditional European religions and traditional folk religions. Now, whenever it comes to migration, many indigenous people have migrated and have become part of urban areas in order to provide better funding for their villages at home, and for their families at home. Some indigenous city dwellers go back to their villages for festivals, but sometimes their donations even make traditional dances and rituals possible. Many indigenous people from Latin America migrate to other continents or countries, either legally or illegally. They'll form small colonies in North America or Europe. In some cases, Indigenous people who have moved to another country have begun charitable institutions that provide education and healthcare in their homelands. But with that, I am going to call it here. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email or text me. The contact information would be found on the assignment for ThinkWave, and I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.